I'm Jay, and welcome to the Relicsmith channel. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Who were these wise men that brought these gifts to Jesus? Today, we're going to take a deep dive and find out who were the Magi. So before we go any further, we got to start with some ground rules and look at the original text in Matthew. Now, the original translation, he doesn't say wise men, he doesn't say kings, he uses one specific word. The original word that he uses is Magi, and it's the plural form. He doesn't tell how many there were, so there could be 2, there could be 200. If Matthew wanted to say kings, he would have a word for that. If he wanted to say wise philosophers, he had words for that. He chose Magi, and that choice matters. Now, to be as accurate as possible, we want to figure out what Magi meant to Matthew's audience at the time. Not what it means now, not what it evolved into, but what most likely Matthew meant when he used the word Magi to describe these people that came bearing gold, frankincense, and myrrh. In the first century Mediterranean world, Magi were a known category of people, not just a vague label. They were known as an elite, scholarly, priestly class, attached to royal courts and empires. They were trained in astronomy, mathematics, sacred texts, dream interpretation, omen readings, and trained to give legitimacy to royal succession. I mean, if there's anyone in the ancient world who has the authority to claim that someone is a king, it would be these Magi. That was one of their big jobs. They were so influential and had so much authority in the Eastern empires that kings could be made or broken off of their word. Ancient authors like Herodotus, Philo, and Roman historians consistently treat Magi as court specialists, not street mystics. So right off the bat, these guys aren't just like magicians and sorcerers, but these are scholars who would interpret the stars and interpret ancient texts. So calling them wise men isn't wrong. That was a later translation. It's just incomplete. Their wisdom wasn't just personal insight, but it was institutional knowledge. So these guys are not your standard astrologer on Facebook talking about Saturn retrograde and that's why you're a little bit ornery today. No, these guys were scholars who tracked the stars, who tracked ancient prophecies, and had authority to help dictate kingship succession, to say the least. So let's look at the history of the Magi and see if we can't possibly connect the dots to the Magi that visited Jesus. So they originate in Babylon and Persia long before Jesus, around 700 to 500 BC. Babylon was the intellectual capital of the ancient world, and astronomical records were kept there for centuries. Babylon was instrumental in mathematics. A long time ago, I made this short little book on the brief history of mathematical concepts and discoveries and contributions, and the base 60 number system. The Babylonian number system was a base 60 system which facilitates very smoothly, since 60 has so many useful factors. Through this, we derive 60 seconds, 60 minutes to an hour, 360 degrees, a complete circle. Also, one of the earliest, if not the earliest, accounts of discovery of the square root of 2 is in a diagram that illustrates a portion of the Pythagorean theorem and illustrates a quadratic equation, which was found in Babylon. And the Babylonians kept astronomical records for centuries. And that's where the Greeks got a lot of their information to base their mathematics and their astronomy, was a lot of these records from the Babylonians. So mathematical cycles of planets, eclipses, and conjunctions were tracked with precision. And when Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BC, Babylonian knowledge wasn't destroyed, it was absorbed into Persian system. The Magi emerge historically as a formalized priest-scholar class. So the empires change, but the knowledge survives. And under Persian rule, the Magi were closely associated with Zoroastrianism, a religious thought which included belief in cosmic order, light versus darkness, divine kingship, time cycles, and moral accountability. Their training likely included advanced mathematics, celestial mechanics, calendar systems, symbolic interpretations of the heavens, and dream interpretation. So all this creates a very sound basis for the Magi to do their thing, which is these calculations and interpretations of stars and figuring out cycles to declare kingship, one thing, and also interpret prophecies and other signs. Now, something very important to note is Daniel the prophet's possible connection to the Magi. Back around about 500 BC, during the Babylonian captivity, Daniel and many other people of Judea were taken into Babylon. Daniel, if you remember, interpreted King Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and also some of Daniel's prophecies are some of the most detailed and prophetic for both the coming of Jesus, the Messiah, and also his second coming when he comes again. And in Daniel 2 and 5 describes Daniel as placed over the wise men of Babylon, chief among court scholars and interpreters. So, some important clarification. Daniel, the book of Daniel, is originally written in Aramaic. The term wise men would later become Magi in Greek. The Septuagint uses the same conceptual category Matthew uses. So it's understood that Daniel wasn't just placed over some wise guys, but he did have a direct connection being placed over the Magi at that time. And no doubt he would have shared many of his prophecies with them, including the timeline he gave for the coming Messiah. So Daniel didn't invent the Magi. He was placed over an existing elite scholarly class and infused it with Jewish prophetic knowledge. Now this matters because Daniel explicitly interprets dreams, he receives messianic and kingdom prophecies, and his influence sits inside the same ecosystem as the Magi. So what happens when messianic prophecy enters the archives of the East, paired with people that are trained to interpret the symbolism of the stars, and these prophecies stay there for centuries? Well, now you're creating the perfect basis for an elite group of Magi who studied Daniel's prophecies and are now seeing the stars rhyme with what are in those prophecies and are recognizing, okay, the Messiah is here. Were the Magi still around hundreds of years later after Daniel? Were they still around in Jesus' time? Well, obviously they were if Matthew was using that specific word. The Magi did not disappear suddenly. They evolve as empires shift, originating in Babylon or Persia, Persia eventually taking over that area, and later being taken over by the Parthians. So these Eastern priest scholars, their lineage persists for centuries. So Matthew doesn't describe a dead tradition, he describes a functioning one. So by this time, the time of Jesus, the Magi would be under Parthian Empire, but still preserved. Now, an important thing to note about the Babylonian exile, when Babylon conquered Judah, some Jewish communities remained in the east, no doubt preserving a lot of prophecies, tradition, and possibly preserving some things that may have been lost during a post-exile Jerusalem. Meaning, you had a small group in Babylon, the rest returning back to Jerusalem and Israel, and you have these group of Jewish communities plausibly having ties to the Magi and incorporating their knowledge into their prophecies. So it's possible that these Jewish communities that stayed in the East may have preserved knowledge that may have been lost over here in Israel. They may have preserved certain temple knowledge. The gifts that the Magi brought to Jesus show a very strong symbolism, not only with the coming Messiah, but also the temple. And I also heard, and I could be wrong, that myrrh was used as an anointing in the ancient temples, but eventually kind of disappeared. So there's some possible connections there of them bringing myrrh that hints that they may have a knowledge that was once lost but preserved through them. Now, another thing to note, Magi is the origin of the word magician, but that really doesn't do the word justice, because that really doesn't notate their origins of this authoritative priestly class that interpreted stars and who were kingmakers, for lack of a better word. Now, where did the Magi that visited Jesus actually come from? Matthew says they came from the east. That's all he says. From the east, that allows for multiple origins. The Parthian Persian sphere, known for the Magi class, they are political rivals of Rome, and they were the authority in king recognition. Then there's the Babylonian scholarly legacy, centuries of astronomical data, and the Jewish prophetic infusion via Daniel. And some have suggested Nabatean Arabia. They're the ones that controlled the frankincense and myrrh trade. They were wealthy and a literate elite. So even if one of the Magi wasn't from here, or they weren't from here, no doubt the gold and frankincense most likely came from the Nabatean area, or perhaps the Magi in their caravans stopped there to acquire the frankincense and myrrh. So as I said before, Matthew's translation is plural of the word Magi, so that allows for two or multiple of Magi. So maybe one of these people came from Nabatea, or multiple parts, we don't know. But it is worth noting that Nabatea was the supply hub for frankincense and myrrh. Now real quickly, what would the Magi have looked like? These guys were from the east, so no doubt that influenced their clothing, and they were most likely wealthy. You don't travel across the desert with very rare gifts without some type of entourage for both getting you through that long journey, but also protecting what you're carrying. And there's lots of indications that the Magi were very wealthy and successful. I mean, these are the people that kings would go to for interpretations on symbolism, prophecy, or for their own kingship recognition. So they probably dressed in not your average Eastern clothing, but something likely to a king. Whatever they looked like, they probably would not have blended in when they come to Judea. Long distance travel like that required wealth. The gifts were very valuable. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh would attract thieves, so security would have been necessary. So they likely traveled in a large caravan, not just three guys on camels traveling a lot across the desert, but a large caravan to accommodate the logistics of that journey, with animals, provisions, guards, and staff. So no one crosses empires with royal grade wealth unless the mission matters. They weren't just wealthy men, but recognized authorities on kingship. So after the wise men saw in the stars that the Messiah was born, they go to Jerusalem first. So why Jerusalem and not right to Bethlehem? Well, if you're seeing in the stars that a king of kings is being born in Judea, where do you go? You'd go to the capital. That's where the current king is, King Herod. It's the capital, it's the seat of kingship. I mean, if you heard that a king was born, would you go to the capital or a random village? Now, when these Magi show up, in Matthew it says, Herod was troubled and all Jerusalem with him. But why? I mean, if these were just random guys, I don't think Herod would care that much. But no, these were guys, recognized authority, kingmakers, and now they're showing up and saying, hey, where's the new king that was born? They're saying that to the current king. But something I find interesting is that it says, and all Jerusalem with him was troubled. So just to take a pause and see why this could possibly be, let's look at history. So in 1st century BC, the Parthian Empire was not some fringe Eastern kingdom. It was Rome's primary rival, a superpower stretching from Mesopotamia into Persia, militarily strong enough to humiliate Rome repeatedly, and crucially, Parthian kings did not rule alone. They ruled with the sanction of the Magi. By this period, the Magi were court scholars, astronomical priests, legal religious authorities, interpreters of omens, dreams, and celestial signs, participants in royal legitimization. They were not entertainers. They were not folk astrologers. They were not mystics on the fringe. They were an institutional power, advisors in matters of succession and kingship. So when it says Magi from the east came to Jerusalem, that is a geopolitical shock. And then to add to all that, you go back a couple of decades earlier, in 40 BC, Herod loses everything. Parthian forces invaded Judea, they captured Jerusalem, they installed a new king, Herod was deposed, and he fled for his life. And so Eastern kingmakers asking about a newborn king, this is external recognition of a new king. All of a sudden that creates a panic. So at the very least, it means Herod recognized their authority. I mean, he later talks and asks them when this star appeared that they saw so he could calculate Jesus's age. So Herod obviously recognized their authority, and probably many people in Jerusalem. Now let's take it back. Think about it. Imagine this caravan of people from the east. Judea is under Roman rule, and you have these people coming from the east, from Roman's biggest potential threat. And now they're talking about a new king. So now you can see why Herod and Jerusalem panicked. Now to conclude, in the next video we'll get into what was it that the Magi possibly have seen. How did they know that the Messiah was born? But I want to emphasize how cool these guys are. I mean, they traveled hundreds or thousands of miles with very symbolic and valuable gifts straight into Judea, straight to King Herod. And King Herod was really dangerous. He killed lots and lots of people. He was a really bad dude. And to his face, they're like, hey, where's the new king? We saw his star. With no fear, these guys were on a mission to worship Jesus, and they knew what to look for. These were scholars. They saw the symbolism in the stars, and they had the authority. But one of the coolest points is these are kingmakers. If anyone is going to declare Jesus as a king and recognize him as a king, this is a great group of guys to establish that in the political world and the Gentile world. These are the kingmakers with authority, and they're coming to recognize the new king.